choosing the right exposure for in-log has a technical and real-world answer to it. So I'm going to do my best to go over some of the technical information, but then I'll also go over some real-world examples from my own personal footage of some in-log shots and, explain kind of why I chose certain exposures and how I try to color correct it. Not that great at it, but we'll give it a shot and hopefully it helps you out a little bit. But before we dive into the technical stuff, I do want to just real quick say that I think there's two main aspects to shooting with in-log that you should take into consideration when you're choosing to film this way. The first is to consider your shooting environment. And what I mean by that is think about your lighting, right? Do you have control over the lighting? Is it studio lighting or is it natural lighting? Is it going to be changing? That's a very important thing when it comes to exposure. How much time do you have to set up the shot? Are you in a rush? Are you just run and gun style, or do you have time to set up studio lighting and really dial in the exposure? I also think about, contrast, how much contrast is in the image. And then I consider what the focus of the image is supposed to be, the subject, right? And then do I want to underexpose it? Do I want to properly expose it? The subject, that is. So, there's just a lot of considerations in that regard of how to expose in the moment. The other component of this, the other aspect I would recommend taking into consideration is your post-production process, your workflow, once you're dealing with the footage later on. And the reason I say that is specifically when it comes to the conversion LUT you're going to use. Because if you use one of Nikon's conversion LUTs, it's going to give you a very different starting point than if you use a third-party conversion LUT, which is something I've been experimenting with recently, and I'll try to kind of demonstrate a little bit of that later on. But the LUT you use, and again, this isn't creative LUT, this is the LUT that you're using to convert it from the in-log color space to the Rec 709 color space. It'll yield very different results depending on which one you use. So be thinking about that when it comes to exposure. I also think about how fast the turnaround time is for delivery. If I know that I have the time to really get creative with the shots, then I still, of course, try to get it right in camera. But I know that I have time to kind of fix it more later. But if you need to do a really fast turnaround time, then you might want to really try to make sure that it's as good as possible. Again, thinking about the LUT that you're going to use later, or if you're going to even manually convert it, which I wouldn't recommend, but that's kind of a whole separate topic. So, those are just some of the things I would recommend considering, thinking about during the shooting process, even though part of that's for post-production. I think that can be really valuable when it comes to finding the right exposure and thinking about what your particular project needs, because again, there is technical answers, but there's definitely a real world aspect to this. So with that said, I'll go ahead and jump into, got my notes here. So jump into some of the technical specifications for in-log. There's not much, unfortunately, but basically, and all this will be linked down below. So if you want to go look at any of these white pages from Nikon USA's website, feel free to do so. But the first thing I'm talking about is the technical guide for in-log recording. And if you go down to the bottom, which I'll put on the screen here, but if you go down, there's a paragraph and it talks about ensuring consistent exposure. And they say that you can film an 18% gray color chart at 35 IRE. Yep, that's about it. They don't really say much else. And I know that from the research I've done, that's considered to be pretty dark, pretty underexposed as far as looking at a waveform goes. So, there you have it. That's pretty much all they say. And then if you look at any of the Z cameras that offer in-log, whether it's to an external recorder or like the Z8 and Z9 that can do it internally, they all have the same in-log specification document. So I'm assuming that this is just, right, this is the first version of in-log and this is just the characteristics of it. And it has this curve talking about the in-log characteristic chart with some equations. I do not know how to read these equations, so if you do, feel free to educate me on that. But that doesn't really tell me much, other than, I get that that's kind of talking about, how many stops of dynamic range it has, but that doesn't tell me, really how I should be exposing it, I don't think. But again, if you know how to read that, please let me know. And then it also has the table down below it showing the gamut and white point for N-log. So it has this information, it has some, but I guess, I don't want to beat the dead horse, but it's like, I don't know. That doesn't really tell me how to actually expose it, but and I have reached out to Nikon to ask them if there's more information, and this is what they tell me. The same documents that I just talked about. So I did some more research, as I've been desperately trying to figure out more on this stuff just out of my own curiosity. And I came across a video by Kalen, I think that's how you say his name, over at White and Reverie. Really good channel. They do wedding films and they're based out of Denver, Colorado. So definitely go subscribe and check them out. But I'll link the video that I'm referring to up here and down below, or up here, wherever it's supposed to be. And I would definitely say check his video out. Got a lot of good information, and he talks a little bit more about color grading, but he kind of sticks with just kind of the LUT aspect of it. He doesn't really go too deep into actual getting creative and all that kind of stuff. But everything I'm going to say is all credited to him, so I don't get mad at me. I'm not trying to steal his information, but basically I would recommend going and watching his video, because he uses a method to kind of reverse engineer to see. He's using in RAW, but he's in log, color gamut, and he kind of reverse engineers to see where the gray card is saying it should be exposed at. It's a little confusing, but I promise if you watch it, it'll make sense. But basically, he comes to the conclusion that if you're planning on using the Z8 version 1 LUT or the Z9 version 2 LUT, which is essentially the same LUT, you should be exposing at 31 IRE, which is very low. And this is, mostly the LUT that I use, and I'm okay with the results. It definitely has an effect at certain times. But I think it looks okay. I don't have a ton of experience with other LUTs, but anyways, so 31 IRE is kind of a reference point if you want to use that LUT. If you want to use the original version 1 of the Z9 LUT, then you can expose at 37 IRE is basically what he comes to. Which again is a little bit dark. We're kind of floating around that 35 number that Nikon put out. So, I don't know. And I know he says it, and I've heard some other people say it, that, a lot of times 40, 41, 42 is kind of where companies recommend you exposing their log color profiles. So again, I hope that's helpful. I hope that gives you at least some guidance reference to look at. But sometimes you're not shooting with a gray card, or I don't know. It's just it only is so useful without more information. But maybe I'm over optimistic on what information they could give that would just make it better. But anyways, I hope that all kind of makes sense. I hope that sort of gives you maybe a starting point if you've been looking for information like that. But anyways, so with all that said, we're going to now transition to Premiere Pro, and I'm going to show you how I deal with the footage, and some tips and tricks, I guess, that I've kind of picked up along the way. So see you in Premiere Pro. All right, so I've brought 2 clips into Premiere Pro here for the sake of time. I don't want to go through a whole bunch of them, but these 2 clips have a lot of contrast. They were difficult exposures, but the first one that we're looking at was done intentionally. I exposed it this way with a certain creative look in mind once I was going to edit it in post, which is kind of what I was getting at before. The second one, as you'll see, was not intentional, and I didn't have control over the lighting. I didn't have control over the situation, so I had to just expose and do the best I could with what I had presented to me. So with that said, looking at this first one, obviously we have the sun setting in the background and kind of a darker foreground. And so my idea here was to really have the couple and the foreground definitely more shadowed. It was intentional to have this darker and then to have the sun kind of a nice glow in the background. So when we look at the waveform over here, which this is what I saw on the back of my Z9 when I was recording this, my goal was to not let the sun clip, which you can see right here. This is the sun being represented on the waveform. My goal was to not let that clip so that I wouldn't lose information. So that's another thing that I would suggest doing, is having zebras turned on so you can see when those highlights are really starting to get blown out, and that the sensor can tell you like, hey, I'm actually not getting information here. But anyways, so we can see, you know, the sun's coming almost 84, 85 IRE, but our shadows are still down at, you know, 15. So this is a very drastic image. Now, before I go any further, I just want to explain something else. This is how I've done it for a long time, and I recently learned that I've been doing it wrong, and this is really frustrating. If someone can explain to me why Premiere does this, be very grateful to know the answer. But basically, long story short, for a long time, and I'm assuming other people have done this as well, or maybe it was just me, but if you come up to the basic correction panel and the input LUT, I always thought that this would just be the conversion LUT. I would come over here and I would click the version 2 and I'd be like, yay, I got it. But then I would bring down the exposure and be like, okay, I want my sun on the waveform to come down. And it would just sort of do this weird flattening thing. I'd be like, okay, well, that just doesn't quite seem right. Like, you look at the sun, and I don't know how to explain it, but hopefully you can see it. Like, it just looks strange, okay? And so what I do now is I come on and I'm trying to make this happen, and we can see the sun looks much better, and it's because I'm applying the LUT on the adjustment layer, if we can see that, right? Adjustment layer is clicked, and if we look at the input LUT, it's on version 2. And then I'm making all of my changes, as we can see down here, to the actual clip. Again, I don't know why this happens, but I'm really hoping that maybe I can save someone a lot of heartache that's been struggling with this. Or again, maybe I'm the only one that didn't know how it worked. But either way, start editing your clips like this. You'll get a lot more range out of it. I mean, you can look at the waveform. We're fully using it. And this is what I was really hoping for when I shot the clip. So I didn't want to completely shadow out the front and get rid of all the detail, but definitely a lot darker. And, you know, we were a big fan of this clip. We thought it looked really cool. The roll off on the sun is really nice. And that brings me to the next point of, I'm using the version 2 LUT for this particular edit. This is what the V1 LUT will get you for the Nikon Z9. That looks terrible. They still look fine, but the roll off that happens, and if you look at the waveform, the roll off that happens on highlights with the version 1 LUT, I don't know. I don't have an explanation for you. If you've been using it and struggling, try the version 2 LUT. Like we talked about it before, that maybe has to do with how I'm exposing it. I don't know, but that looks terrible and I want nothing to do with it. So I haven't used the version 1 LUT in quite a while. But anyways, you can see that, you know, the foreground is relatively similar, but for whatever reason, that roll off, I mean, look, that looks so much more natural compared to that. And then this third one is pretty similar to V2, but this is actually, if you look at the adjustment later, this is a base LUTs Nikon N-Log, and this is from Gamut, I believe it's called. This is a third-party LUT. It was actually helped to be created by Kalen over at White and Reverie that I mentioned earlier, and watching his video actually got me to buy this LUT. It's $5, and sometimes it gives you a better option because it doesn't push the highlights as much as the version 2 LUT does. So if I go ahead and reset all the edits and then reset these edits, so I'm not resetting the LUT, right? So we still have the V2, and we still have now this one. You can see that right off the bat, the V2 pushes the sun really bright, right? And then the third-party one does not. It keeps the sun a lot lower. It's a lot less contrasted, a lot less saturated. So depending on what you're trying to do, this could be a better starting point. So I hope that makes sense for that first example. Let's move on to the second one. So this is why it was difficult. This was the ceremony. I couldn't ask these people to move. I couldn't change the location. I couldn't change where the sun was. This is sometimes just what you're presented with, and you have to do your best. So if you look over at the waveform, again, I did my best to not clip my highlights, but get this as bright as possible. This is way overexposed for what Nikon recommends. And again, maybe this isn't the right way of doing it, but for me, I'd rather it be too bright and risk clipping the sky in the background and try to make sure that the couple up here in the front are exposed as well as possible than try to expose it technically correct and then have to deal with bringing up shadows like crazy and all kinds of nonsense, you know. So maybe this is a subjective opinion, but this is the argument that I was trying to make earlier by saying, you know, you sometimes have to just do it from a real world experience level and, you know, think about how you want the final thing to look. If we look at the version 1, which proof adjustment layer, we have the version 1 selected up there in the top, and then all my edits, not much, it's right here. And this isn't terrible. Again, I don't know why this happens in the highlights. It looks really strange. It's just, it almost, I don't know, it just doesn't look right. But if we look at the waveform, everything looks dandy. And that, you know, it looks, you know, okay, it's a little bit brighter. There's not a ton of contrast, but, you know, and then our couple are, you can see them, they're a little bit shadowed. But if we come to the version 2, the people are relatively more exposed. If you pay attention to the two bridesmaids over here on the left, they look a little bit flat here, like the shadows look really flat, you know, but here you have a little bit more contrast and dynamic, you know, look to their faces. And if you look at the bushes in the background, they're a lot brighter. There's a lot more contrast in the bushes, which is a little bit distracting, but this is a lot softer. And specifically around the bride's face, you can see there's a lot of highlight roll off around her hair, and it's a lot less drastic here. Now, I did apply some edits, of course, but I was trying to just edit each of these as best as I could given the LUT. And the sky also looks much better on the version 2. And then this was the base LUT, the third party LUT. This was more difficult. I'm still a bigger fan of the version 2 LUT in my opinion. And granted, these were just quick edits, so with some more time, I probably could dial these in a little bit better. But again, the bridesmaids over on the side, which they're not really the subject of this image, but they are a part of it. You know, I think that there's a little more contrast and it looks a little bit better on the version 2. So yeah, I hope that's helpful. I hope just seeing these all right next to each other gives an example and illustrates what I'm talking about when it comes to same exact clip with different LUTs applied, and you're gonna get different results. So consider all this stuff, consider what your subject is. You know, you wanna think about that while you're shooting, before you're shooting. You know, maybe if you're in DaVinci Resolve, maybe there's more tools that I'm unaware of that would help fix this. Of course, you could go in and do a lot of masking and change a lot of stuff. But you know, even here, if you really look at it, if I were to just drop the exposure all the way down, you can see the detail is still in the sky. It's still there. We didn't lose it. We would if we applied the LUT directly to the clip, like I said earlier. But now our foreground is way too dark. So I hope this makes sense. I hope this helps clarify what I was getting at earlier, being that, you know, just because you expose it perfectly, given the technical examples, doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get the result that you're looking for in post. So thinking about all that stuff before and during shooting, and then considering how you want the final thing to look, is all part of how you're actually going to choose to expose your image when shooting with InLog. As I said in the beginning, there's a lot to this. There's definitely the technical and the real world answers to how to expose in-log. I hope this was helpful. I hope seeing how the footage actually reacted gave you a good idea of what I'm talking about and why it's important to consider this stuff. In-log is very useful. It does work well. The two examples I gave you were extreme examples. Obviously, in normal context, it's going to look really good. What you're watching right now was filmed in in-log, and I was able to manipulate it and really dial it in with very little effort because I'm in a studio environment. But when you're out and you're using it, you're going to retain a lot of detail, but just keep in mind that it's not the same as our eyes. You're not going to be able to retain everything. So that's probably understood, but just want to clarify on that. Again, play around with the different LUTs. Think about which LUT you want to use before you shoot. Practice with the LUTs before you shoot for a client. Don't just assume that you're going to be able to make it work. And as always, try to just keep shooting and get better. So yeah, that's really all I got for this one. I hope this was helpful. As always, I'm here for a conversation. I'm here to learn just as much as I am to try to share information. So please feel free to leave a comment down below and correct me on things or ask me questions or anything of that nature. I'm here to be a part of this community and do all that. So thanks for watching. Hope you learned something, and until the next one, see ya.